They
We're
can
well.
see you on my screen.
Oh, perfect. Hi, everybody. Okay, thanks so much. I'm so excited so many folks are here. And thanks, Keisha, for such a great overview of the immense amount of work that we undertook in the past year. It always feels like you've got a billion tiny tasks on the go as you're doing it. And so it's really nice to like reflect and see all of the big things that we accomplished. That being said, I just do want to give like one really quick plug for some upcoming events that you can come hang out with us on. One of them, again, the casino. Please sign up. I will be contacting everybody. It's so important. And it's really rewarding. You know, I got to spend like 2 full days with Paul last time, which was great. Or evenings, I guess. And then another really exciting event that we have coming up on October 24th is an art and conservation event in partnership with the SNAP Art Gallery. And it's going to be an opportunity to come talk about caribou conservation while learning how to do lino cut art led by the artist there. So that'll be a ticketed event that I'm sure Elise will be sending everyone a notice about. But I will get started on our presentation. So, yeah, this presentation that mostly Wes has put together is on a nature strategy for Alberta, something that we do deeply believe that we need. So we're going to quickly cover biodiversity, why it matters, what's going on globally, and then we'll be presenting an outline of what CPAWS believes is an absolute must to be included for a nature strategy in Alberta. But I think it's really important, first off, for us to just kind of think about why biodiversity matters, why does nature matter, and why is this something that we are trying to strategize around the conservation of. And this is something that I think for all of us in the room or who are joining us online, at least for myself, I have a really hard time articulating why it matters because I just know intrinsically that it matters to me and that it's important to me. But that's not often enough for folks. And recently this year in an interview with the CBC about caribou and the impacts of wildfire on caribou, the reporter asked me, why would it matter if we lost caribou? Like, so what? And I didn't have a good answer for her. It was kind of unfathomable to me that someone couldn't understand why that would suck deeply. So yeah, I guess, you know, we hear from economists and folks often trying to put a dollar value on nature, but that doesn't really capture the true cost of biodiversity loss. But in the last 2 weeks, I've come across 2 different instances that I do think did a good job for me kind of being able to articulate why it matters that we lose biodiversity. The first was just last Thursday, we attended the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute's AGM, and there was a couple really compelling presentations. And one of the first presenters talked about this one flower that had been named, found, researched. It was the rosy periwinkle. And I was like, that's cool. It's a pretty flower. It's nice. It turns out from that flower, scientists had isolated 2 different compounds that are absolutely essential in fighting a number of different cancers, and they're still used in chemotherapy today. And so I thought that was really interesting. He went on to then talk about how those compounds were used in the chemotherapy that helped save his mother. So that was a really impactful story to hear. I went and dug around a little bit. In his presentation, he'd mentioned that almost 40% of pharmaceuticals used today are organism-based, so come from nature, come from biodiversity. And then I found this from the World Health Organization, that they estimate as much of 80% of the world's population depends on plants and animals for their medicines, for their health and well-being. One of the other stories that I came across just in the last 2 weeks was this horrifying study that got, I think deservedly so, a lot of media. And that was that scientists in studying bat population collapse in North America had been able to directly tie the loss of bat populations to the death of children, which is a really heartbreaking thing to think about. But as many of you probably know, white nose syndrome is a fungal infection impacting bats across North America. It causes them a lot of irritation and the inability to hibernate properly. So they end up expending a lot of energy when they should be hibernating, and eventually dying. And in areas that there is agriculture where they've faced these population collapse, they use 30% more pesticides. And the harmful chemicals and pesticides can be directly tied to childhood deaths. So that was really shocking as well. I guess this isn't meant to be entirely depressing. It's just when asked why is nature and why is the conservation of biodiversity important, these were two instances that had really tied it directly to human life. And we often think about intact nature and conservation as really important for our well-being, our health, but it's often kind of this like conceptual thing and not really directly tied to human life. But I see nature as a really important part of my life, and it was very validating to see these explicit examples. That was a very long-winded tone setting for this presentation and why this really matters. So my apologies, but these are things that I think we really need to think about because, as Keisha mentioned earlier, we are absolutely in a biodiversity crisis. And we are facing Earth's 6th mass extinction. And one of the only one that has been driven by a single species, and that is humans. Sorry. So the UN report that's linked here from 2019 suggests that there's about 1 million plant and animal species at risk of extinction. And that same report highlighted that it's, overwhelmingly driven by habitat loss and degradation of marine and terrestrial environments. It also spoke about what I found quite shocking, is that nearly 75% of freshwater resources are allocated to human uses. While that was a global report and could be thought of as something that's happening somewhere else, it's absolutely not. It is happening here in Alberta. We're not immune to the problem. And here in Alberta, over 90 species are listed as at risk, so threatened, endangered, etc. And the drivers here in Alberta are the same as found globally. It is habitat degradation, habitat loss, and just truly human alteration of habitats. And I think it's really sad that this degradation happens and this lack of protection and conservation, or at least this greater need for it, is occurring, even when Albertans themselves really highly value nature. So these stats up here are from a poll that we conducted in Alberta in 2022. And we always knew that Albertans love nature and want to see it protected, but the results were quite striking in this poll. It was overwhelming that Albertans are concerned about the loss of wildlife. And 77% of the respondents were supportive of increasing conservation and protection. So I'll pass it over to us.
Cool. So yeah, we all understand why biodiversity is important. We have an understanding now of the threats to biodiversity, both globally and in Alberta. So we're going to do a little bit of a dive, well, a very brief dive into the kind of global policy context, which Keisha touched on earlier, before looking at what Alberta can do, some kind of more uplifting opportunities that we have within Alberta. So as Keisha mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity was one of 3 global conventions that got introduced in 1992 at the UN Earth Summit in Rio. There have been several frameworks and policy guidelines that the CBD have developed since then. One of the ones you might have heard of in 2010, there was a strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020, and that included the IKI targets, which you might have heard of. The one that kind of most people know of was the 70% of terrestrial land needs to be protected by 2020. We didn't meet that target, nor did we meet any of the other targets, but the progress was made on a lot of them. And when member states met in 2022 in Montreal, where CPAWS was present, they came up with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which aims to catalyze, enable, and galvanize urgent and transformative action. And I've added the kind of the bold text here, by governments, subnational and local governments. So this doesn't have to be at a national level, and with the involvement of all of society to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So just kind of briefly, there are 23 targets, as Keisha mentioned, for 2030. These are kind of within 4 goals for the 2050 vision for biodiversity. And for each target, there's a series of indicators. So for example, for target 1, which is to plan and manage all areas to reduce biodiversity loss, there are 3 headline indicators, 1 component indicator, and 10 complementary indicators. And we're definitely not going to go into all the details on all of those, but it's just to say that it can be quite complex. But the framework exists for countries to develop their own national and subnational biodiversity strategies and action plans. So since 2022, there's been a large focus on the targets within Goal A, and specifically Target 3, which I think many of you would have heard of, which is 30 by 30, 30% of land and sea by 2030. And while a focus on Target 3 has been useful for galvanizing support for the global biodiversity framework, we kind of have to be a little bit careful about emphasizing Target 3 so that it doesn't happen, meeting Target 3 doesn't happen at the expense of a lot of the other targets. So you could have areas that are declared under Target 3 that actually are more suited to some of the other targets around sustainability, for example, or you might start over-reporting on areas that aren't adequately protected for Target 3 in order to reach that goal. So what do we think Alberta should do to protect nature? What has Alberta done to date, and where are we at now? So on this graph on the x-axis is the year since 1885 to now, 2023, and the proportion of Alberta is on the y-axis. The top green line is this half-Earth idea, and this is the idea that's been promoted by a lot of scientists, including E.O. Wilson in his book, Half-Earth, also referred to as nature needs half, which is basically we need to protect half of the lands, of the Earth's land surface in order to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. The second line is the 30 by 30 targets, Target 3, and the orange line is Alberta's protected area coverage so far. So we're sitting at about 15% of Alberta protected. Yep. So between 1885 and 1917, that kind of jump is basically national parks, Wood Buffalo and the Rocky Mountain National Parks, but also Elk Island. That got us to around 8%. And then there's a little bit of a blip in 1958, but the next kind of more significant rise is related to the Special Places 2000 initiative, which I think some of you be aware of and were involved with. There was a new designation, the Wildland Provincial Parks, and that led to an increase in the amount of coverage within Alberta. And the third The third kind of gain was around 2016, where multiple indigenous-led kind of initiatives around wood buffalo resulted in the largest contiguous protected area within the boreal region. Next. So yeah, within the context of the CBD, kind of going back in time, since 2022, we've more or less added nothing to the protected area network. So if Alberta were to commit to the 30 by 30, we've got about 5 to 6 years to double the protected area kind of coverage within the province, which sounds daunting, but it is possible if action is taken now. And then the strategic plan for biodiversity and the IT targets came about in 2010. And between 2010 and 2020, Alberta added about 3% of protection. And then when the Convention of Biological Diversity was signed, we were sitting at about 10%. So between that and 2010, they added about 2%. And in the time since the CBD has been around, we've added about 5%. So basically, this is just to say that the annual kind of, the global frameworks have potentially kind of promoted some like impetus behind protected area expansion in Alberta, maybe arguably not enough. But if we are to reach the goal of 30 by 30, we're really going to have to up the ante. So spatially, this is what protected areas in Alberta look like, dominated by national parks, so wood buffalo in the northeast and the Rocky Mountain National Parks in the southwest. And essentially the wildland provincial parks, more or less, that surround them, plus a bunch of different designations. But the national parks, they make up about 8% of the protected area network, so more than half of what is protected in Alberta.
Okay. Yeah, so it's pretty clear that we've got some pressing issues that have to be addressed provincially to achieve these biodiversity targets. And you know, while individuals across the province care deeply about nature conservation, and like many people around the world, take a lot of individual actions to try to achieve the best that they can for nature every day. In Alberta, 60% of the land is public land, and it's the responsibility of our provincial government to manage in trust for the people of the province. And so that's just to say that we feel like it's the responsibility of the government to set policy, direction, and legislation to change and improve the conservation of nature. And this should be coming in the form of a nature strategy to meet these nature strategy requirements outlined in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we at CPAWS feel that this strategy needs to address biodiversity loss, ecosystem function, water security, something we're all very concerned about. And it should be happening through and include measurable goals and ambitious and achievable targets, which we can do this in the province, as well as some very specific actions. And this is not a new concept or concern for the province, sorry. And nobody in the province would be starting from scratch to achieve any of these things. And it is very clear that the nature strategy for Alberta needs to leverage some of these existing policies, legislation, and information that already exists. Huge amounts of work have been done in the province to try to address these conservation issues. That includes the land use planning, the land use framework that was introduced in 2008. It enables the province to create land use plans for the different regions of the encompassing all of the 7 major watersheds. This is an incredible tool to use to dictate where different land uses that create habitat disturbance can and cannot occur, and achieve some of those goals. There's also a draft policy for Alberta's biodiversity that was introduced in 2014, and that sets out direction and guidance on biodiversity conservation and management within those land use plans. So it helps enable these biodiversity frameworks. This has also not been used. There's also, we understand and know where most of the environmentally sensitive areas across the province are. We know where the priorities are for us to start protecting for species at risk, for sensitive habitat, for irreplaceable habitats, et cetera. And that exists through the environmentally significant areas of Alberta. We really do have this great body of knowledge and this legwork to move forward with the creation of a robust nature strategy for Alberta. And with that, CPAWS has started to develop our own proposed nature strategy for Alberta, which does include some of those details about what we think Alberta can do to meet those nature strategy obligations under the global framework. And we believe that they should be driven by the following 6 guiding principles. So meaningful action, effective conservation, reconciliation, community involvement, sustainability, and comprehensive planning.
So yeah, along with these guiding principles, we've also developed 6 pathways, which we believe the province should be following to implement the nature strategy. We're going to go into a little bit of detail on each, including an example or 2 of some immediate opportunities for the province. If you don't mind. So yeah, as Tara mentioned, the framework exists for comprehensive land use planning, which is our first pathway. Alberta's landscapes are highly disturbed, so the goal of land use planning needs to be functioning and connected terrestrial and aquatic habitats, which still provide cultural, economic, social, and health benefits for Albertans. And some immediate opportunities include the fact that we need to complete the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan, and we need to start the rest of them. Only 2 out of the 7 have been completed. We need to complete all the Caribou sub-regional plans, and within those, implement and establish new protected and conserved areas. The second pathway is parks and protected areas, and these play a key role globally in recovering species at risk, in supporting climate action, and in maintaining local economies. Alberta's protected areas network needs to expand with Indigenous leadership and collaboration to provide equitable recreation and cultural opportunities and improve the conservation of ecosystems and wildfire. And some opportunities there, the province needs to finalize all management plans for all protected areas, and these need to be continually monitored. They need to work with Indigenous communities on IPCA or OECM proposals. And some of these already exist and have been worked on for a long time by Indigenous communities like the Deneta and the Bisto Lake region. Other effective area-based conservation measure. So they just dropped the AB because it made the acronym too long, I guess. Yeah, our third pathway is biodiversity conservation. So fulfilling the commitment to species at risk, including species listed under the Provincial Wildlife Act, requires a preventative and a restorative approach. Efforts to protect natural habitat at the landscape level will prevent further habitat degradation, fragmentation, and associated recovery costs. Specifically, we need to complete and implement recovery plans for all species under the Wildlife Act, and focus recovery on wood bison, particularly those that occur on provincial land like the Ronald Lake and Wabasca herds. The fourth pathway is sustainable economic opportunities. So when Alberta's natural ecosystems are well managed, they can provide endless economic opportunities from sustainable natural resource extraction to recreational tourism. But to ensure sustainability, we need strong, up-to-date collaboration and comprehensive efforts to avoid irreversible damage from industrial activities like oil and gas, forestry, and mining. Specifically, we need an open and transparent analysis of oil and gas and legacy coal mine liabilities, followed by adequate funding towards the cleanup of closed and abandoned sites. Forestry legislation needs to be updated to conserve and maintain healthy forests, and a new coal policy that bans exploration and extraction in the eastern slopes needs to be developed. The fifth pathway is Indigenous-led conservation. It is vital to recognize the importance of Indigenous ways of knowing and leadership in restoring and maintaining biodiversity. We need to support Indigenous-led conservation and co-management, and as I mentioned before, support already existing initiatives like that led by the Denetah First Nation at Fish Lake. The last pathway is nature-based solutions. So natural spaces provide clean drinking water, carbon storage, flood and drought mitigation, and food and habitat for wildlife. To retain these services, many of the nature-based solutions will be addressed through the previous pathways. But one specific example would be to halt peat mining activities in Alberta. But together, these 6 pathways can help to protect a version of nature that includes ecosystems and the important species that live in them, including caribou. I think that's you.
I loved this animation. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we need a commitment, but the crux of having a nature strategy is to have that commitment from the province to be halting and reversing biodiversity loss and making all management decisions with that goal as a priority. And, you know, a made in Alberta approach is absolutely possible, but it has to bring with it the quality and leadership that we expect from the people of Alberta. And these commitments also need to come with financial backing so that they can be actionable. So this brings us to the next convention of the parties or conference of the parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is COP16. It's happening October 21st to November 2024. And the big focus of this conference is going to be reviewing countries and subnational governments' commitments and those NBSAPs, so the biodiversity strategies and action plans. And we have concerns that the government of Alberta's reluctance to align with the federal government could hinder them, but there is an opportunity for them also to follow suit from other subnational jurisdictions, like the province of Quebec. They've established their own separate, but also very ambitious conservation commitment to the GBF. And they are going to be announcing this, I believe, at the subnational conference, which is like a sub-conference of the big conference, where subnational governments like provinces or cities are going to be announcing their commitments to the conservation of nature. And we do fully expect, I guess we don't expect, but we would expect of our government here in Alberta to have a commitment to the halt and reverse of biodiversity loss and the conservation of nature that everybody loves so deeply. So that brings us to this next fun thing about what you can do. Oh my gosh, I was really worried there wasn't actually going to be a QR code in this slide. So huge thanks to Elise. Yeah, what you can do. I mean, as always, we are always encouraging people to practice democracy every day and contact your MLA to tell them that you care about this and you do expect them to make a commitment to the conservation of nature. So please call your MLA and let them know that you support more protected lands. The other exciting thing that is happening is the government of Alberta just last week announced that they are developing a strategy for nature, the Alberta Nature Strategy. And we have put together a survey guide, like we normally do, and there's a public engagement. So you can go to our guide and see what we would say, which includes a lot of the elements of the nature strategy vision that we just shared with you today. And you can use that to provide feedback to the government of Alberta's nature strategy public engagement, and use your voice to ensure that a nature strategy for Alberta is strong and one that actually commits to action.